Hi there! Welcome to the section of our client onboarding course on establishing communication. The lessons in this section will show you how to set up strong communication patterns between your agency and its clients so you can avoid confusion and missed connections down the road. This is an absolutely vital part of the client onboarding process because it establishes behaviors and expectations you can rely on throughout the client-agency relationship. In this lesson, we'll show you how to set up templates for a communication plan that can be applied to each new relationship as sales roll in. While communication seems like a really simple concept, it can end up being the downfall of an SEO project. The more people are involved and the more moving parts there are, the greater the risk of skipping over a crucial piece of information or leaving someone out of an important conversation. Creating a solid plan for communicating with each client helps to streamline your discussions, whether planned or incidental, and ensure that nothing slips through the cracks. In creating a communication plan, you want to answer a few basic questions about the project. With every new client, your team needs to establish what information should be communicated based on the project's needs and the various stakeholders' expectations, how that information will be communicated, formally or informally, written or spoken, when communications will occur, where or using what tools, and who is responsible for providing and receiving each individual communication. Some of these answers will be virtually the same across every SEO project you take on, and they can be adopted as agency policies that every specialist and every client is expected to adhere to. For example, you might determine that every SEO client should engage in monthly check-in meetings at a minimum, or that your account managers should only communicate certain project information via email or Basecamp where it can be tracked and audited. We're going to structure our communication plan template around the how and the who because establishing those expectations for each project early on will help the other pieces fall into place. Now, the first time you do this, it might seem a little complicated and nitty-gritty, but once you have a template and some experience fitting a new client into that mold, you can easily replicate the process whenever you sign on someone new. Your agency may also choose to use slightly different terminology or only certain pieces of these templates. The goal is to save time on future projects, not to create extra work, so your leadership should decide what makes the most sense for you. Our example communication plan consists of two matrices to fill out and incorporate into the documentation you keep for each client project. That documentation might also include a formalized project plan with a description of the project and the client's goals, meeting notes, guidelines around the client's branding and website standards, and anything else that might need to be referenced throughout the relationship. This documentation will probably live within your project management or CRM tool of choice. Our first matrix has to do with communication methods. That's the how of your communication plan. Generally speaking, there are 4 types of communication you'll be using with your clients: formal and informal written communication, and formal and informal verbal communication. At the beginning of each project, determine which method should be used for each piece of information you'll need. First is formal written communication. You might decide that this defines things like your client contract, the full project plan including goal setting that you'll develop throughout the onboarding process, and the monthly reports you'll send to the client. Once finalized, formal written communications should only be altered with the approval of key stakeholders, and they should usually be kept in a secure location, in paper or digital copies or both, within your agency's files at the office or within your project management tool. Informal written communication might define things like emails, Slack or other instant message services, text messages, and social media posts and messaging between your agency and the client. The language used in these is usually going to be less precise, and the content can be more flexible. Determine what your policy will be regarding the types of information that can be communicated through each of these methods. If monthly reports are to be uploaded to Basecamp, for example, don't suddenly switch things up by sending some via email instead. The most significant difference between written and verbal communications is that verbal communications can't be tracked and audited as easily as written ones can. When you write an email, upload a file, or even send a message through Slack, there's a digital record of that communication that you can search for and use as a reference later on. While phone calls and meetings can be recorded, parsing them is more time-consuming. This means you should take care when determining which information can be communicated verbally and which should be written out. Formal verbal communications usually consist of scheduled meetings, like the kickoff meeting and monthly or weekly check-ins with the client. These meetings should always have agendas, and attendees should avoid straying off topic to ensure that the defined scope of the meeting remains accurate. Finally, informal verbal communications are the ones many of us are most familiar and comfortable with. These are the conversations you have with your coworkers, impromptu calls with the client to answer quick questions, and any unscheduled meetings or check-ins with the client or with your supervisors. These conversations are less structured and can be hard to remember precisely, so if you find yourself in the middle of one that seems important, don't be afraid to say, let's schedule a formal meeting on this topic so we can involve more people and make clearer decisions, or let's follow up on this conversation via email so we can easily reference what we talked about. Whatever policies you establish at the beginning of the engagement, share them with your client and reinforce them to ensure nothing gets lost along the way. These policies might even be written into your standard client contract if you plan to reuse them across multiple accounts. The second matrix in our communication plan aims to answer the who questions within your client relationship. Who is responsible for providing and receiving all the pieces of information that must be communicated throughout the project? This matrix should include a list of every stakeholder involved in the project on both sides of the engagement, client and agency, define who they are, and list the communications they're involved in and how those communications should occur. Let's look at some examples. Our first stakeholder is Mr. Stark, the account manager at the agency. We've got his name and role listed here, and to the right, we've listed 3 types of communication that he's responsible for, plus the expected frequency of that communication or the event that should trigger it. He's the one who provides planning documentation at the kickoff of the project, leads meetings with all stakeholders at kickoff and then on a monthly basis, and provides monthly reports to the client as well. At your agency, maybe it's the SEO specialist who leads meetings or provides reports. You can adjust accordingly. A lot of the communication expectations on the agency side will be self-explanatory to you and your team because they'll be based on company policies about who runs meetings, who makes the weekly calls, and so on. But that information is still good to share with the client so they know who to expect to hear from. Here's an example of a client-side stakeholder for this project. Ms. Danvers is the marketing manager at the client XYZ brand, and we have expectations for her as well. She attends the stakeholder meetings that are led by the agency account manager. She also attends weekly check-in calls with the SEO specialist, and she receives those monthly reports. Your stakeholder communication matrix really should include everyone who's involved in the project. You can see that we even have an example of a client-side developer here. Including everyone ensures that no piece of communication, even incidental items like ad hoc updates on smaller developer tasks, falls through the cracks. This plan doesn't leave any room for someone to say, I don't know who to email about this problem, or I just completed a task but I don't need to let anyone know, because there's an expectation in place for every scenario. So how do you make these decisions about who should provide and receive what communications at which times? Well, the client should have a chance to weigh in, but you should consider each stakeholder in terms of their influence, interest, and involvement. For example, the account manager on the agency side and the marketing manager on the client side both have high levels of interest, influence, and involvement in the project. But the client's CEO often has high influence with low interest and involvement because they're mostly busy running the company. You can make these judgments on your own and use them to create a first draft of this matrix. Then share it with the client during the first kickoff meeting and adjust the plan based on their preferences or stakeholders or communication items you might have left out. Combine your communication methods matrix with your stakeholder matrix. You might even make them into one big spreadsheet with the method listed alongside each expected communication. Once the plan is solidified, add it to your project documentation so that both sides can refer to it whenever they have questions. You might also want to add email addresses and phone numbers to this plan for quick reference. When you think like a project manager, your communications will improve. Creating a communication plan might seem tedious, but it'll get faster as you add more clients, and it will save you from confusion during the project when your energy should be focused on getting things done. See you in the next lesson.